Let's get to it. We are learning about Parshas Acharei Mos, which can be found, of course, in Vayikra, starting with whichever chapter, but we're not starting at the very beginning today. I'd like to take a look at Perek Yud Ches, that is chapter 18. Let's just look at it from the beginning, and we're going to focus on a couple of psukim near the beginning. The Torah has I wouldn't say extended introduction, but an important prelude to the laws which follow in chapter 18. And the important prelude is the following. So we're looking at the beginning of chapter 18 in Vayikra. It can be found, if you're with me, in the art scroll, Chumash 640. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I'm the Lord your God. This formula, of course, appears many places. And again, it's a kind of standard prologue. Now here the Torah says the following. In accordance with the ways of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, Losasu, don't emulate the ways of the Egyptians. You live there, don't go back, don't retain the influence, shake off the influence of the Egyptians where you dwelt. And in accordance with the behavior, the conduct of the people of Canaan, where I'm taking you, also Losasu, don't do that either. Don't walk in their statutes. Now, the last words are important, but it's not going to be for us tonight to explore. I want to consider, what is this Masa Eretz Mitzrayim? What is this behavior, the actions, the deeds of the Egyptians and the deeds of the Canaanim? Now, the next pasuk says, "Es mishpatai tasu," rather my ordinances shall you fulfill, v'schuka, or rather my laws, v'schukosai tishmor, and safeguard my decrees, l'leches behem, to follow them, ani Adonai Elechem. And then it says, which seems to be a repetition of that. And then the Torah goes on in the rest of this chapter to explore in some detail a whole range of sexual misdemeanors or transgressions that the Torah specifies as being forbidden. Now, what I like to consider is, what is the importance of this somewhat detailed prologue, mentioning the ways of the Egyptians where you lived previously, the ways of the Canaanim that you're going, where I'm taking you. What about other nations? What about other habits? And most intriguingly of all, although, as I've just said, the Torah implies that the reference here is to the debauchery and the promiscuity and the sexual depravity of the Egyptians and the Canaanim, the Torah doesn't exactly spell it out. It's only by implication, by the context, by the fact that the Torah goes on to describe, as I said, a range of depraved behavior which the Torah forbids. But in the verses that actually set or proscribe, that forbid emulating the behavior of the Egyptians and the Canaanim, the Torah doesn't say clearly what that behavior is. So Ksav Sofer, as he often does in a very concise way, almost oblique way, refers to the parish of Ramban and also the parish of Ibn Ezra. So I took the trouble to crack open those Mefarshim, and I want to share with you, by way of approach, what Ramban says, and Ibn Ezra, and then we'll see how Ksav Sofer has his own, I think, very interesting and very, I think, cogent take on that. So he says, so says the Ramban, he quotes Ibn Ezra, but I'm going to save Ibn Ezra for the second part. So says Ramban, Eretz Canaan, the ways of Canaanim. So says Ramban, al ha'arayos, this refers to sexual immorality. Canaanim behem ra'im v'chatim kasher Amar Basof. As the Torah goes on to say, now later on the Torah specifies that the various forms of depravity and degenerate behavior caused caused the land to spew out its inhabitants, namely the Canaanim. Says the Torah, don't let the same thing happen to you. If you repeat the habits of the Canaanim, you'll suffer the similar fate. So it's quite clear, I mean, it's pretty much explicit that the Canaanim were depraved in this manner. Also, if you think about it, Canaan, okay, well, let's just go a bit further in terms of what Ramban says. So he says the Torah says all of these forms of loathsome and depraved behavior. Asu anshe haaretz, the people of the land acted that way. This is later on in verse 26. The Torah says, as I've indicated explicitly. So the Canaanim, when it says Kemas Eretz Canaan, it means sexual transgressions. Says Ramban that the Chachamim, the sages, maintain that this is what the Torah means regarding the Egyptians as well. Egypt was also a place of promiscuity. Now, it's interesting. The Torah itself, when it describes Mitzrayim, doesn't explicitly say that. We find that the Egyptians were idolaters. Of course, in antiquity, they were all idolaters. We find that, of course, Pharaoh was a despot. He may have set himself up as a god. And again, that was not rare in the ancient world either. The Torah implies that the Egyptians were also sexually immoral. Certainly, the wife of Potiphar propositioned Yosef, as we know. But again, that kind of like sharp description of human interaction, human temptation, even though the behavior of the wife of Potiphar betraying her husband, seeking to seduce Yosef, is definitely reprehensible, it does not necessarily tell us that that somehow like encapsulates the depravity of Mitzrayim. Nevertheless, according to Chazal, that was the case. Like I saw the Hasidic Meforshim say that the land of Mitzrayim is called Ervas Haaretz, and that's just a drash. But we do still find the turn of phrase, the nakedness of the land regarding Egypt. And moreover, in the Malachim it says Kigan Kadesh Haya Ba'aretz, they had male prostitutes in Egypt. Male prostitution is considered to be, in a way, more reprehensible than the female prostitution. I don't need to dwell on why that exactly is. And says Ramban, quoting a pasuk in Yechezkel and elsewhere, we do find clear indications, as I said, in Yechezkel, in Malachim, that Egypt was promiscuous, was debaucherous, was depraved, although it's not explicit in the way that we find about Sodom and about Canaan. So basically, says Ramban, when the Torah speaks about Egypt, speaks about Canaan, those nations exemplified, those nations were distinguished for their depravity in this regard. Says Ibn Ezra, and Ramban quotes Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says, look, let's consider what the Torah actually tells us. So take another look. Pasuk Gimel, it says, don't follow the ways of Egypt where you dwelt there. Look at the next pasuk, Pasuk Dalet, verse 4, es mishpatai ta'asu, but rather keep my mishpatai means my laws in the sense of civil law, laws that regulate society, laws that are described in the portion, says Ibn Ezra, of mishpatim. And this is the difference, according to Ibn Ezra. It says mishpatai tasu. When it says chukusai tishma leleches bahem, so that refers to the sexual immorality associated with Canaan. But when it comes to Mitzrayim, it means that they were immoral in their personal interaction. They were guilty of different forms of theft or breakdown of society. They did not have a system of justice. That's what Ibn Ezra says in those few words, based on the fact that the Torah says mishpatai, because the word mishpatim is not generally used for laws regulating sexual immorality. Remember, most of the examples that the Torah precedes to describe are possibly, as we would say today, between consenting adults. The Torah also forbids coercive behavior in general and in the sexual realm as well. But most of the examples or the specifics that the Torah identifies are between, as I said, what we would call consenting adults. So the word mishpatim usually refers to the breakdown of society in which people exploit one another, they assault one another, they rob one another, they take advantage of one another in ways which are rapacious. It usually does not refer to the moral code of sexual immorality. This is the point of Ibn Ezra, but as I say, Ramban disputes that. Ramban demonstrates that Mitzrayim also, according to the sages and according to the Tanakh, we read in the Nevi'im, Mitzrayim also was guilty of that. If you think about it, Canaan and Mitzrayim both were the sons of Ham, and Ham, of the three sons of Noach, Shem, Ham, and Yafes, if you remember, Ham and Canaan especially, but Ham, was the father of Canaan, was also guilty of sexual offense, whether it was incest or other forms of debased behavior with regard to his father Noach. So it's as if the Ham line within Shem, Ham, and Yafes is prone to reprehensible sexual offenses, and therefore Mitzrayim and Canaan are grouped together in this regard. So says Ramban. Says Ksav Sofer, maybe both opinions have not just some validity, but they reinforce one another. And this is the point that the Hiddush, the novelty of Ksav Sofer, which I find fascinating, I want to share with you tonight. I find it quite compelling, in fact. He says that actually, if we think about it, when I say we think about it, even a child who was old enough to learn the story of Pesach, who was awake at the Seder. By the way, we were in South Africa for Pesach, where the Seder begins at around, if you want to start promptly, around 6:30, not like here in London, where it doesn't get underway till 9 or later. So my point is that a young child can more reasonably be awake at the Seder, or more easily at least. My point is that every person knows that, of course, the Egyptians, what did they distinguish themselves? In what respect was the Egyptian behavior reprehensible? What is explicit in the Torah in several chapters, nearly the first half of the book of Shmos, is all about the exploitation of the Egyptians of the Jewish people. Their crime that the Torah pronounces, that the Torah paints in broad strokes, is not sexual immorality. It's the fact that they exploited the Jewish people, the fact that they tormented them, the fact that they enslaved them, the fact that they embittered their lives, the fact that they exhibited extreme cruelty towards the Jewish people. That is what the Torah emphasizes. So it may well be true, as Ramban says, that if you look closely at the biblical evidence, we see that Egypt was corrupt in other ways as well. That may well be so. But when the Torah says, Asher Yashavtem, where you lived, when the Jewish people lived very unhappily in Egypt because they were exploited and enslaved and they embittered their lives. You say, but at first they treated them very nicely. Well, that's just the point. They quickly exploited them. What about Hakara Satov? What about appreciating the beneficence that Yosef and his brothers bestowed upon Egypt? Well, they forgot about that very quickly. A new king arose who did not know Yosef. So they also were kafuye tova. They denied the benefit that Yosef bestowed upon the Egyptians. In other words, my friends, the crime of Egypt was the cruelty, was the rapaciousness, was the way that they were quick to exploit and extort and torment the Jewish people. Says the Ksav Sofer, is that in some way connected to the debauchery of Canaan? so that the Torah links them together. The Torah says, don't emulate the Egyptians, don't learn from the Egyptians, don't sort of absorb from the Egyptians the degenerate, reprehensible behavior of the Egyptians, nor follow the ways of the Canaanim. Says Iksav Sofer, yes, they are connected. And here we get the title of our little discussion tonight. Children need fathers. Says Iksav Sofer, quoting the Gemara, that we find that chutzpah, effrontery, a kind of brazenness, a callousness towards others, a self-centeredness is associated with illegitimate birth. It says it in a place where, or in a context, or in the instance of a person who is born out of wedlock, and it doesn't just mean out of wedlock technically, but someone who is the product, you could say maybe through no fault of his own, but he's a product of a union which is incestuous, or which is extramarital, or which is the product of behavior which is immoral and which the Torah forbids. A child who is the product of such a union, or a person who grows to adulthood and his background is that kind of sordid backstory, says the Gemara, that such a person will often be a person of chutzpah, a person lacking in refinement, lacking in sensitivity, lacking in humanitarian impulse, lacking in philanthropy. A child who grows up without a father figure often is blighted. His life is blighted in so many ways. And I remember reading an article, and nowadays, I read it years ago before the internet era, but now today you can Google it in a heartbeat, to just Google, why do children need fathers? And I'm not here to moralize. I'm just observing that sociologists and psychologists and others, also those involved in public policy, have charted the consequences of a child growing up without a father. So, says Iksav Sofer, the cruelty of the Egyptians and the debauchery of the Canaanim, they tend to go together. They are like fellow travelers. They're allied trends. And he says that's why the Torah says in the next pasuk we've already seen, but in Pasuk Gimel in verse 3, the Torah says, don't be like the Egyptians, don't emulate the Canaanim. The next pasuk says, but rather keep my laws and safeguard my commandments. Laleches behem. Ushmartim eschukosai, the next pasuk says as well. In other words, if you keep the Torah, if a person observes the Torah, imbibes the teachings of the Torah, the effect will be, and again, it's certainly not a guarantee, but the influence of studying the Torah and observing the Torah and imbibing the teachings of the Torah, the influence will be to subdue a person's baser instinct, to enable him to overcome and to rein in and to channel and to sublimate the sexual desire. And in that way, by the same token, the Torah also promotes philanthropy, decency, honesty, humanity, humanitarianism, I meant to say, a sensitivity, care for others. And in that way, says the Torah, in these two short pair of psukim, the Torah says, according to Ksav Sofer, don't be like the Egyptians who were cruel and who were lacking in hakaras hatov, and don't be like the Canaanim who were debaucherous and promiscuous and immoral, because those two tendencies go together and one reinforces and promotes the other. But rather, keep the commandments of the Torah, and in that way you will be, I don't want to use the word saved, but you'll be insulated to a degree, at least. You'll be in a stronger position to resist those tendencies and those behaviors that are exemplified by Egypt on the one hand and by Canaan on the other hand, and they are two sides of the same coin. So these are my thoughts about the subject of our top talk for tonight. And there's more to follow right now about fathers I'm sorry, children need fathers. Let me look now together. Let's look together at the next pasuk, but I want to focus on a completely different aspect of it. Pasuk Dalet, which you've already considered now, but let's read it one more time. Says the Ksav Sofer, pay close attention to what the Torah says towards the end. Es mishpatai ta'asu, my laws you shall perform, v'schukosai tishmoru, and my commandments you shall safeguard, laleches bahem, to go in them. So Ksav Sofer has a short but fascinating piece, which I'd like to elaborate upon a little bit, when he says about those words, laleches bahem, to walk in them. And although he doesn't say so outright, but it's interesting that the word for Jewish law, which is familiar to us all, is halacha. Halacha really means the way of going, the way of walking. Lalechet is to walk, or to go, to progress. Says Ksav Sofer that the Torah is urging a person, when it uses that expression, laleches bahem, to go in them, the Torah is urging a person to progress, to advance. He says, laleches mi madrega le madrega, from one level to advance, to progress, to proceed to a higher level. He says a person has to always be one who is achieving, who is progressing, never stagnant, never complacent, never frozen in his place. So he says in a few words, he alludes to what he says later on. So I turned a few pages further in my parish of the Ksav Sofer to the portion of Bechuk Hosai. Remember, the portion of Bechuk Hosai, the end of Vayikra, begins in Bechuk Hosai, Telechu. If you walk in my statutes or my ordinances, in Bechuk Hosai, Telechu. The word Telechu again is that same word. So over there, Ksav Sofer says the following. Makes a very important observation, which Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, about a generation later, would also elevate to a central position in his teachings about the Musar movement, his teachings regarding the Musar enterprise. I said a generation later, actually they were contemporaries, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and Ksav Sofer. I wonder if they ever met even, perhaps they did. Says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter that a person has to be content with his level of material achievement, but always aspire to advance in the matters of the spirit. Or to put it slightly differently, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says that my material well-being is materialism for me, but your material well-being is a spiritual concern for me. That is to say, I should take an interest in improving another person's material circumstances. Why should I? Because my own spiritual growth is dependent, or should embrace, should include a concern for the well-being of another person, even in the physical realm. Says Ksav Sofer that the midah of histapkut, the feature, the feeling of of sufficiency, that a person is contented with his circumstances, he says, is very important. I'll read a few words. Rosh v'rishon lemidos hatovos. It's the first and the most important of the good midos, is the feeling that I'm contented with what I have. I'm not grasping. I'm not highly possessive. I'm not seeking to amass greater wealth, greater prestige, greater power, greater renown, greater fame, greater authority. I don't feel the drive in that regard. Says Ksav Sofer, that's in the physical realm, or as I was saying, in matters relating to personal aggrandizement. But in the spiritual realm, a person should always aspire to more. Like Oliver Twist said, please, sir, I'd like some more. When it comes to spirituality, a person should always want more. A person should never be contented, should never be complacent, or a person should never feel a sense of self-sufficiency in realms of the spirit, but rather a person excuse me, should always seek to aspire to acquire a higher level. And this is a path in life. And he says, as a almost paradigm, the personality of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was on his deathbed, and his Talmidim came to visit him, maybe to seek, well, certainly to seek his blessing. Excuse me, as they realized that his excuse me, his human powers were waning at the end of his life. So they sought his blessing, and they saw he was crying, and they were baffled why he should be so upset. Of course, nobody is pleased about the prospects of death, but he seemed to be like very anxious. And they said to him, to their Rebbe Yochanan Zakkai, why are you so stressed? So he said that I'll read a few words. Eini odea le'ezeh derech molichen osi. I perceive, I foresee two paths before me, meaning when I leave this world, two paths extend into my destiny, and I don't know which one they're going to lead me upon, the path of Gan Eden or the path of Gehenna. And of course, his disciples were astonished, the great leader of Israel, and he's so concerned. The answer, for our purposes, the Ksav Sofer says, is that you see that even someone as great as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai always felt uncertain, always felt maybe I haven't achieved what I need to achieve. Maybe I've fallen short of my not only my potential, but my obligations in this world. Says the Ksav Sofer, that's why the Torah says in Bechukosai Telechu, if you're always on the move, if you're always, like it says right now in our pasuk, Laleches Bahen, to progress in them. This is what I would like to call progressivism in the Torah way of thinking. Never static or complacent. Then the Ksav Sofer, what I've told you up to now is what he mentions here in a few words, alluding to what he says later on, and I've elaborated a bit further because that's what he does say later on. But here he adds a beautiful drash, which I want to share with you, and we'll end with this. He says that the Gemara tells us that the generation in which David ben Yishai will arrive. It's a way of saying when Mashiach comes. The generation preceding the arrival of Mashiach will be a generation of great turmoil. The Gemara describes it in many different ways, I'm sure all of which are meant to be understood metaphorically, but what links them all is great upheaval, great chaos, great uncertainty, great anxiety, great like turmoil. And as an example, one of the things that the Gemara says is the Kenim Ya'amdu mipnei hanarim, that elders will stand up in the presence of the younger ones. And it says, it gives another example. I'm sorry, just read a few words of the Gemara. Narim pnei zekenim yalbinu. The youngsters will shame or will humiliate their elders rather than respecting them. They will denigrate them. They'll mock them. They'll scorn them, deride them. Zekenim yamdu mipnei anarim. The elders will be forced to stand up out of respect for the younger ones rather than the opposite. In other words, rather than respecting and venerating and valuing the wisdom and the, dare I say, the piety of the older generation, the youngsters will say, what do they know? That is a feature of the Messianic era, of the turmoil and the upheaval that will usher in or will sort of represent the total breakdown of society that will finally only be restored and be rectified through the coming of Mashiach. So this is quite well known and much has been written about it. But here's the beautiful drash of Ksav Sofer. He says that Ya'amdu, to stand, is to be understood as a alternative. Sorry, I'm still a bit dehydrated. We only flew overnight in 12 hours from Johannesburg, and so excuse me for that. Ruthie very kindly gave me a hot tea, but it's too hot for me to drink. So I'll drink it afterwards in a moment. I want to finish up though. Says Iksav Sofer, Ya'amdu doesn't mean just to stand up. That's a simple understanding. It means they'll stand out of respect. The elders will stand out of respect for the youngsters rather than the other way around. He says, Ya'amdu, they will stand, they won't be able to progress. The religious, the older generation who want to keep the Torah, they will struggle just to stand in one place. They will struggle just to maintain their probity, to retain their integrity. They won't be able to progress. But the Torah says here, "Laleches bahem," the Torah says, you've got to progress. Says the Ksav Sofer, the upheaval and the turmoil is described as the younger generation who deride, who scorn, who taunt, who mock the elder generation, so that the elder generation, they struggle just to keep in the same place, because the generation of free thinkers, that say, are seeking to destroy the whole edifice. So he says that Ya'amdu means that they won't be able to improve. They will struggle just to stay in one place, just to sort of remain stationary, even that, to preserve the authenticity of the Torah. It's interesting that, and he may be even alluding to this, in American Judaism, we have Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. The Orthodox, you know what they are. The Reform, also we know. Conservative means they try to conserve that which has been transmitted in previous generations. They haven't succeeded very well. I'm not sure if they've tried hard enough, probably not. But the idea, this is what Ksav Sofer says here, the older generation will struggle just to conserve, just to retain something. What about progressing? What about improving? What about advancing? What about always aspiring to greater and higher levels of religious piety and devotion, and not only in the realm of religion, but of morality, of ethics as well. This is the aspiration. This is the characterization of the Jewish person, or I should say even the Jewish people collectively, that the Torah says, "Laleches bahem," to progress. Always to aspire to greater achievement. But in the upheaval of the end of the generations, the Torah is describing where it will be difficult even to keep in one place. And of course, this is what we have seen, certainly in the days of the Ksav Sofer, in the 19th century till the first half of the 20th century, we have seen the diminution, or almost the downfall of the religious edifice. Baruch Hashem, in our own times, in the last generation or two, we have seen side by side with the deteriorization, we've also seen a progression in the Torah sense of improvement and advancing as well. So this is what the Ksav Sofer shares with us tonight. It's based, as we have seen, just on these two psukim, the habits that characterizing the Egyptians and the Canaanim, which according to Ksav Sofer, the Egyptians, of course, were cruel, and the cruelty of the Egyptians may have something to do also with the debauchery, and with, like we said, children need fathers, and in the absence of the stable family unit, unfortunately, a personal character will frequently suffer. And then we said, Laleches bahem, always to improve, never to be satisfied and to be complacent, but always to seek to advance and to achieve greater levels of Torah appreciation, sensitivity, awareness, musar, and all of those great principles to which we hopefully all aspire. Thank you again. Sorry for my slightly tired state. Hopefully we'll also improve very soon. Just want to mention as well that we're starting Pirkei Avos. For those who are local to us in Golders Green, please join us at 7 o'clock on Shabbos evening, an hour before Mincha. We are going to continue with our Pirkei Avos series, and we are going to look at where angels fear to tread. So please join us for that Pirkei Avot Shabbos afternoon. So thank you, and thank you for the welcome back, and good Shabbos to all.